Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are diving into the world of online gaming. And, it's not always fun in games.
Yeah, it can get pretty intense.
We're actually looking at this YouTube transcript. It's from a channel called Scouse Sit-Off. And it's raw. It's firsthand. It's not like we're analyzing some academic paper here. This is real stuff.
Right, yeah, it gives you a glimpse into that subculture.
Totally. And the guy at the center of this whole thing, his name is Darren, and he claims to be the target of, well, basically online harassment.
That's unfortunately a common theme we see in a lot of these online spaces.
Yeah, and he really paints this picture of, like, being constantly targeted by this other gamer, this guy who calls himself Mondo.
Mondo. And he makes it sound like Mondo has this whole crew of people.
It's like a whole operation.
Yeah, and it's easy to see how someone in that situation, constantly feeling under attack could become, well, a little fixated.
And he does seem obsessed with this Mondo character.
Yeah.
Like, he even describes what he thinks this guy looks like. It's kind of creepy.
Right, and that's something we often see with these online feuds is this tendency to kind of almost like demonize the other person,
Yeah. And then it gets worse because Darren starts talking about this other gamer, a guy called Inquisitor Ghost.
Okay. And this is where things take a really, really dark turn.
Because Darren claims that this Inquisitor Ghost guy was driven to suicide.
By Mondo and his crew, he says.
Yeah. Now, obviously, we have to be careful here, right?
Yeah, we only have Darren's side of the story.
We're not saying Mondo's responsible for this tragedy, but it does raise these questions about online harassment and how it can really affect people in the real world.
It's a serious issue, and it's something that, unfortunately, we see far too often.
And it's like, how do you even begin to address something like this?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because the internet provides this anonymity.
Right, like it's easy to hide behind a screen name.
Exactly, and it can make people feel like they can say and do whatever they want without any consequences.
Which is obviously not true, but...
No, it's definitely not true. But it's a difficult thing to police.
So we've got Darren claiming to be a victim of this relentless online harassment, but then you start reading his messages in the chat, and he's not exactly innocent himself.
Right. He's got a bit of a sharp tongue on him.
Yeah, he's definitely giving as good as he gets. So it's like, where do you even draw the line between victim and aggressor in these situations?
That's the thing. It becomes so blurry so quickly, and it just spirals.
It's a vicious cycle, and I have a feeling it's only going to get more complicated from here. It's wild how Darren tries to spin it, Like, all his angry rants, all the insults he's throwing back, he's like, oh, it's just self-defense.
Yeah, it's this weird distortion of morality, Like the rules are different in that online world.
Totally. And then there's this whole thing where he's railing against people being snitchy, as if reporting harassment is worse than the actual harassment.
Right. It's like completely backward. And it speaks to that whole us versus them mentality that you see in these online communities, especially in gaming.
You're either with us or against us.
Yeah. And if you're not actively participating in the bad behavior, then you'd better look the other way or else you become the enemy.
It's messed up. But I guess it makes sense in a way, right? Like, if you're trying to maintain that sense of belonging, that group identity, you can't rock the boat.
Exactly. Even if that means turning a blind eye to some pretty awful behavior.
So it's this toxic cycle, and it's all being driven by this almost mythical figure of Mondo.
Right. Mondo is like the puppet master, the one pulling the strings.
Do you think Darren is, like, maybe even a little bit drawn to that, like the power Mondo seems to have?
It's definitely possible. There's a certain allure, right, to being part of the in-group, the dominant force.
But especially in gaming, where it can feel so competitive. Like, everyone wants to be on the winning team.
And when that desire to belong, to win, outweighs everything else, that's when things can get really dangerous.
Yeah. And that brings us back to Inquisitor Ghost. Regardless of whether or not Darren's version of events is accurate, it's a stark reminder of how devastating online harassment can be.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that words have power and that the internet is not a consequence-free zone.
So what can we do? I mean, how do we even begin to address this problem?
Well, I think it starts with awareness, making people aware of these dynamics, of how anonymity can fuel bad behavior, but also how important it is to speak out against it.
So education is key.
Absolutely. And it's not just about teaching people what not to do. It's about fostering empathy.
Right. Reminding people that there's a real person on the other side of the screen.
Exactly. Because ultimately, I think that's what it comes down to, isn't it? Remembering our shared humanity, even in the digital world.
It sounds cheesy, but it's true.
It's not cheesy, it's essential. Because if we lose sight of that, then we're really in trouble.
We've talked a lot about the dark side of anonymity online, but because it's not all bad.
Oh, definitely not. Anonymity can be incredibly empowering, too, especially for people who feel marginalized or silenced in their offline lives.
Right. It allows them to connect with others, to share their stories, to build communities.
And that can be life-changing, especially for people who are struggling. So it's about finding that balance, you know?
Between the good and the bad.
Exactly. And I think that's an ongoing conversation, a conversation we all need to be a part of.
Absolutely. And it's a conversation we're going to continue right after this.
Yeah.
It's like, how do we encourage the good without letting things, devolve into toxicity?
Right. It's tough. It's not just about policing content. We need platforms that are actually designed to promote healthy interaction.
Okay. So what would that even look like?
Well, I mean, you see some companies trying, right, with content moderation and reporting systems. I even saw something about using AI to flag harmful language.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've heard of that.
It's a start, I guess. But ultimately, technology can only do so much. We need a real cultural shift online.
Towards
empathy, accountability, basic respect.
So it's less about censorship and more about creating an environment where that kind of behavior is just not cool.
Yeah.
Exactly. We need to build online spaces where people feel safe, where they feel heard, even if they disagree.
It's easy to get bogged down in the negativity. It seems like every day there's a news story about online harassment or toxicity.
Oh, absolutely. It can feel really disheartening.
But we can't forget that there's good out there too.
Right? Tons of it. People use the internet to connect, to support each other, to build amazing communities.
It's like any tool, right? It can be used for good or for evil. Depends on the user.
100%. And I think that's a really important point to remember, especially in the context of everything we've been talking about today.
So as we kind of wrap things up here, any final thoughts for our listeners?
Well, I mean, if there's one thing I want people to take away from this, it's that online interactions are complex. There are real people with real feelings behind those screens.
And that our words have weight.
Exactly. Whether we're talking about online gaming, social media, whatever, we have a responsibility to be mindful of how we're interacting with each other.
To think before we post. To choose kindness whenever possible.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. And everyone listening, until next time, stay curious and stay kind.